Now can I call Patrick Harvey, please, to close the Greens. 6 minutes, Mr Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'll be supporting the government position and the Labour amendment. Obviously, I'll be opposing the Conservative amendment, and I'm afraid that the Liberal Democrat one places just a little bit too much confidence in the idea that shared decision-making will in fact protect the people of Scotland. I'm not at all convinced that it will. I suppose it was pretty much inevitable that today's debate would involve at least one or two rants about separatists, and that name being thrown across the chamber from people who support the Brexit project, apparently calling us separatists without either self-awareness or irony. I think it's pretty clear that supporters of independence at the moment are the true internationalists in the chamber, and we'll continue to make that case. There were a number of people right across the chamber, though, who clearly share the central concern here that there is a mechanism for an internal market, but no principles for how that internal market should operate. That's what's being proposed. Whether we're talking about principles of subsidiarity, proportionality, sustainability, a whole host of principles we could debate, they are not defined in the UK government proposals. And this is why it was also a little strange for me to hear the phrase internal market and single market used interchangeably, perhaps unconsciously used interchangeably by some members. The EU single market is clearly defined according to certain principles. The UK proposals for its internal market are not defined, and we've got evidence from a number of other respected bodies to say that this very term is itself contested. It is clearly premature to legislate on it in that circumstance. There was another slip of the tongue being made by a few members, including some on the SNP side, who accidentally, instead of talking about the single market or the internal market, talked about the free market. These are fundamentally different ideas. Whether you're a hard-right libertarian who gives guest lectures with the Cato Institute, or you're a social democrat who believes that market activity needs to be regulated well and effectively in the interest of the public, there is an argument for having a single market, for having a wide area that complies with, broadly speaking, the same rules and conditions. It's not a free market. A single market, an internal market, does not determine whether we should be running a free or a regulated market. And one of the phrases that's been used a few times is around what would be bad for business. I think the Minister talked about not wanting to do things that are bad for business. I say we do need to do some things sometimes that are bad for business. If governments through the ages had taken the view that we should never do anything that's bad for business, never mind minimum unit pricing, we wouldn't have paid holidays, we wouldn't have abolished child labour, we wouldn't have a minimum wage if we had never been willing to do things that are bad for business. And the Scottish Parliament's Finance and Constitution Committee didn't say that there should never be any barriers either. What it said was that we recognise the economic benefits to businesses across the four nations of having a set of rules that ensures there are no barriers. Equally, we recognise the benefit to society of having effective regulation of market activity and the role of all parliaments, including this one, in deciding how best to strike that balance. And that's the important point here. There are obviously those who would like to take power, not just away from this Parliament, not just away from Scotland and the other devolved nations, but taking power away from democratically accountable institutions and giving it to the market. And there are those of us who believe the whole economy ought to be democratically accountable. But it is for elected parliaments to decide how best to strike that balance. The proposals coming from the UK government will remove the ability, not just of this Parliament, but of others, to decide how best to strike that balance. The Scottish Government says that there will be no barriers to trade, and I would agree that under their preferred option of common frameworks, I agree it's unlikely that there would be significant barriers to trade, but the principle is that this Parliament and others must be free to act, and parliaments must be free to judge whether those actions are proportionate and whether any consequences for trade are proportionate, and we can be held democratically accountable for those decisions. Mr Lockhart tried to persuade us that the common frameworks, not the UK internal market proposals, but the common frameworks, will deliver new powers. What nonsense! In any policy area that's wholly reserved, common frameworks don't even arise. Common frameworks arise because measures are being debated which do cover existing devolved competencies. So common frameworks are not about devolving new competencies. They're about deciding how to... They're an invitation to align, to agree how we coordinate on areas which are already devolved. Adam Tompkins, I think, did recognise my central concern that we have the design of a mechanism for an internal market without the appropriate principles being attached. And I hope that he'll vote accordingly. I hope that if the UK government continue with their current proposals, he will oppose them if they're unchanged. Finally, Presiding Officer, there were those on the Tory benches laughing at the suggestion that the Thatcher government was one of the drivers of the movement for devolution. I think it's very clear that that was the case. And if they can't bring themselves now to defend devolution and Scotland's democracy, what we chose over 20 years ago, if they insist on cutting the powers of Scotland's Parliament without the permission of Scotland's people, in the interest of a free market extremist ideology, they will drive ever more people toward one inescapable conclusion, that Scotland can, must and will govern itself.
Thank you. I call